Hey, welcome back, everybody. Of course, you know me. My name is Dr. Keith McNally, and this is the Question Guy podcast. I'm here with Kevin O'Connor, and we're going to be talking about something that's been on a lot of people's minds lately, especially now in 2023, when we can actually really feel more comfortable talking about it. And we're going to talk about grief and what that is and what that means and how it impacts our lives. Kevin actually wrote a book with the word grief in the title. I don't know if we're going to get to that book, but it's going to be an interesting conversation nonetheless. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Keith. Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate you engaging me. Thanks a lot.
So, before we even begin the conversation, who are you by profession, and then who are you personally? We want our audience to be very comfortable with you because things that we may say may trigger something, and so we want to know a
Sure.
little bit about you.
Professionally, I don't think I'm ever at the end, but I've retired from full-time educator, being an educator for almost 50 years, starting as a teacher in 1973, and then going into being a principal, elementary principal for 21 years, and then the last 7 or 8 years of my career, I was a facilitator in Broward County Public Schools in Fort Lauderdale. I was a facilitator for uh, curriculum that focused on sexual health for kids. How do they navigate? How do they learn about their sexual health? I was training teachers about how to do the curriculum. And then also I was in an advocacy program helping LGBTQ youth and their families to, in some cases, for some kids, survive the school system, how to find contacts in the school system and the community to help navigate their own coming out
Mhm.
and how to do that. So that was that's in a nutshell, that was my career. Uh, and then lately I've been getting more involved in writing and doing some community work with those subjects that I just talked about too. But and personally, my husband and I have been together for 18 years, been married for since 2015. Between us, we have 5 sons and we have 6 granddaughters, ranging in age from 5 years old to 22 years old. And they're spread out all over the place. And so we spend a lot of time with them. But I was married twice in my before I was married to him. That's where the two kids came from one of those marriages, my 2 sons. And then that was for my second wife, and my first wife was prior to that. And I I, for the word that's commonly used, I came out. If there's an official coming out, I did that when I was about 55. So, so I'm 73 right now. So that was when I went through a decision process with myself and with the mother of my children, who were then in their 20s, um, about what to do about the situation. And we decided to end the marriage and move on. And in that moving on, I met Leon, my husband, we've been together for 18 years and have a great life and enjoy spending our time with our kids and our grandkids and doing some traveling. So
Well, where
that's
is
the personal
everybody?
part.
You said you were in Florida. Is everybody in
Yeah.
Florida?
No,
Oh,
Keith. Um, my granddaughter is in Illinois,
okay.
not too far from where they were raised and where I was raised. I have another son who's in St. Paul, Minnesota. He's a nurse. We just spent some time with him.
Okay.
The other sons are come from Leon's marriages, and 2 of them are right in the Fort Lauderdale area. We see them a little more frequently. And they have 4 daughters who are finishing high school and spread around in different places for their schooling. And actually, they're not spread around; they're all at the University of Florida. And then there's another. Leon has another son, and his 2 children and wife live in Philadelphia. So we get up to Philadelphia too. So most of our travel, we has to do with our distant travel has to do with ways to get in touch with the kids that are not in Fort Lauderdale.
Uh,
So that's what we do.
but at least you still have the opportunity to do that, and that's really good. And
Yes,
so,
very fortunate, very
yeah.
fortunate. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And earlier before the call, you said you wanted to take a look at the topic of grief, and I want to applaud you and thank you because you have taken a look at some of my previous conversations on
Yeah.
grief on
Mm-hmm.
the Question Guy podcast. And what were your thoughts on those conversations before we get into our conversation?
Well, sure. And as we were talking beforehand, I was listening to the one guest you had, Deborah Brown, and and she has become well known in the area of grief in the UK. I'm very intrigued in the UK with what they're doing. So what struck me about our conversation was I heard from another person then what's going on in the UK about trying to infuse the understanding of death and grief into the school curriculum, which is something that, having been a 50 some year educator, I've never known to have that done in the United States, and yet it's such a major part of life. So that's one thing that's intriguing me at this point, very recently, that there's more people talking about that. The other thing that she talked about, and another one of your guests talked about, was the theories that were present in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, which were very prevalent in my family, which was my family, my father and my uncle were undertakers. But the idea that there were stages to grief that was popularized and by Elizabeth, the author Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and who to her credit, did a lot of research and with knowledge she had at the time about there's stages to grief, and I think that's in some ways that's probably helped people over the years.
Right.
What your two guests pointed out was that 50, 60 years later, people are starting to unpack that theory, and based on other people I've talked to in the last 6 months, I concur. Grief grief doesn't have a stage that ends. Deborah Brown talked about, when you think about a stage, you think it's something that begins and ends and you go to the next stage. That doesn't happen. All those 7 stages are all they're jumbled up into like a Venn diagram, or they're bubbling or moving around like goldfish in a bowl. They're going to come up to the top at different times.
Mhm.
And as survivors, as people that experience grief, it's healthy to be ready for those things, those ideas and those thoughts as they re-enter, because they're not going to go away. They're just going to come back and visit at different times in my life, different formats, different situations. Um, and it came to light again. I was at my class reunion last week, 55 years of since high school. But the spouse of one of my colleagues, who they had lost a son in adulthood in the last 5 years, 10 years. And she has become very involved in her own grief, but also counseling and helping others. And I really think she is testimony, were your prior guests, that grief is now being talked about more than it ever was. And it was something, uh, I think when my family was running the funeral home up through 1980, you had the funeral and you go back to your house and your home and you go back to work, and there wasn't a lot of emphasis in the industry at that time. What do families do? What's an individual do? What's the undertaker do
Yeah.
with that grief? So that's some of the things that are intriguing me currently, based on my interactions with you thus far, and just something that happened as recently as last weekend with my class reunion. So,
Well, I like that you talked about we're unpacking the theory. We're unpacking the context of how we're dealing with and looking at and handling grief in our lives because it's really a combination, a mixture of emotions that, as you said, will bubble up from time to time. So sometimes you may be angry and you may be angry for a while and then depressed and then sometimes confused or guilt ridden.
mm-hmm,
There's a lot of emotional ups and downs when we're dealing with loss. And even one of my conversations with Gulam Fernandez, sometimes we even regret things that we didn't say to the individual
mm-hmm,
when we
mm-hmm,
had the opportunity. So uh, being able to deal with our emotions, one, allowing them or allowing ourselves to feel, to
mm-hmm,
express whatever that is, it's going to be a needed thing because what we're finding is that when we don't, because we're human, it's going to come out anyway. And if we
mm-hmm,
don't deal with it positively, it's going to come out in very negative, hurtful ways.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So go back to your, you grew up in a very unique family situation. How does
Hmm.
take it talk us through that, please. Talk us through what it was like growing up.
Well, thanks for the invitation to talk about it. Um, yeah, my uncle and my father owned a funeral home in a town called Elgin, Illinois, northwest of Chicago, and my uncle started the business in 1930. My dad joined him in 1939, and in the midst of the growth of the business in the 30s, my uncle bought a Victorian house that was built in the 1880s because his business was growing and he needed not only more space for the funeral business, but he needed more space for his own family. In the late 30s, he now had three daughters, all under the age of 10. And then he had my father join him, who was newly married, and with the birth of my older brother on the way. So they needed a space to expand. And so they moved into this old Victorian house that was falling apart, partly a victim of the Depression in the 1930s. It just hadn't been taken care of. So my uncle was able to make an offer and get the property. And then he and my father started to refurbish it and make it into a place where people could come and have their funerals. And then there was apartments upstairs, a second floor apartment and a third floor apartment. Hence the title of my book, Two Floors Above Grief. But the intriguing thing about the apartments was that this used to be a one family house, a big house. And so the second floor was a collection of bedrooms. So they went up there and made bathrooms and kitchens and kitchen and a living room. And the third floor became our family apartment, and that was a ballroom of the original house. So the ballroom had two stages where in the 1800s and early 1900s, the owners of the house would entertain and they would have their guests go up to the ballroom where there would be an orchestra or people that would play so people could dance and be entertained. So
But that had to be
so one
converted because you said you
yeah.
lived there.
Yes, yes. Well, that was the other thing that happened, I think. Well, one thing that happened was it's not unusual for people that are involved in the funeral home industry to have the family live in the building or next door to the building, or you needed to be close to the building.
Mm.
I think that some of that may have changed now with the way communication systems have changed, but you needed to be present on the premises about 24 hours a day. So it was common for a family to live on the premises. What was different for us was that we had two families. And these two families, I call them conjoined apartments, because in order for me to get to the third floor apartment, which used to be the ballroom, in order for me and my brothers and my mom and dad to get there, we had to walk through my aunt and uncle and cousin's apartment. So there was always an interchange, always people talking, always. I really essentially had my own birth parents, but I had a set of additional parents, and you might call my cousins, but they were more. We were raised more like siblings, even though we were had a range. We had a 20-year age range, but we were raised more like siblings. So that's part of what you use the word unique. That's part of what made it unique. The other thing about these stages that were now we're using stages in a different way than Kubler-Ross, of course. These are performance stages, but the stages, my bed in the bedroom I had a stage in it. So when we were kids, my parents, when they reconverted the third floor in from this ballroom into a kitchen and a living room and two or three bedrooms and a family room, they left the stages there for a while. And so it wasn't unusual. I mean, my bed was butted right up against the stage, and there was an area underneath the stage where my mom and dad used it for storage, but we used it for another play area. And we had another stage in what became our family room. So it was not unusual for us and my friends and my cousins to get up on the stage and put plays together and sing and dance and to this day, that idea of theater has stuck with me. I'm always involved in community theater. In fact, I'm going to rehearsal in a few hours. So this many years later, I really have to say that it was how many people grow up next to a stage? So that made it
Not in their
unique
own
too.
house.
Okay, in their own house.
Yeah.
And when I was about 6 or 7, my parents made the decision to do some remodeling and remove the stages so that we would have more living space instead of stage space. But it still sticks in my mind and really adds to the uniqueness. And so that's some of the stories I tell in the book about how our families lived above the funeral home, where there was this grief going on with the families of the clients. How did we live in that funeral home setting? How did we live as families? How intertwined were we, or were we not intertwined with the funeral home itself? And so
Well,
that's
that
part
really
of,
then begs the question. Now I'm
yeah.
curious. Did you, growing up in that environment, you had to have seen young kids your age whose family member has passed or
Mhm.
something to that effect. How did you interact with the families who were receiving services, whose
Mhm.
family members
Mhm.
had died? And how
What I
did it really
recall, I
impact you?
wouldn't, unless I knew the family, I really wasn't interacting. The role I did play, one of the things my uncle had my brother and I do, my brother's a year younger than me, my younger brother. Um, One of the things he had us do to help out was he would have us open the front door for people as they came in out of their cars, and we were the greeters. And hi, my name is Kevin O'Connor. What family are you here to see? And then we'd open the door, and then when we would guide them verbally or physically, if we needed to, up this set of stairs so they could get to where the wake was occurring. So that was one way. So I wouldn't necessarily know the particular family. I might know some of the people that were visiting. So, as they came to the door, they might say, "Hey, Kevin, how are you?" And I'd say, "Hello, Mr. So-and-so. Hi, Mrs. So-and-so. How are you? And who are you here to see tonight?" So that was one way that my dad and uncle had us be infuse us a little bit in the business. Back to your question. Yes, there were some families where classmates of mine or friends of mine might have lost their grandmother or their parent or maybe a sibling. So for those kinds of wakes, I would make an effort, or I would go and at least visit and say hi to my friends and say sorry for your loss. I mentioned another situation in the book where it was one of my classmates who died the summer after we graduated from eighth grade. He was uh, he was he stepped on a electrical wire and was killed about less than 2 months after we graduated. So that one hit me personally and intertwined my teenage life with my family's profession. And so even at that time, my dad counseled me to say, and my dad and uncle didn't tell us a lot about the details of a family's services. They kept that very separate, and they were very respectful of the families with whom they were
Sure,
talking to and helping.
sure.
But they didn't bring that conversation up to the dinner table or say, "Hey, this guy died this way," or "This woman passed because of this." They didn't share that.
Okay.
But when Francis died, that was my friend, then it was my friends and their family were coming over to essentially my house to um to come and pay their respects. And so I remember I have this remembrance of my friends hanging out with me after they might have gone up to the family and paid their respects or viewed the body, or I think the body wasn't shown. Can't remember, but they were hanging out with me on one of the side porches outside. It was August, so they would hanging out with me. And as I look back, each one of my friends had different ways of dealing with this. It was for some, it was their first experience with death, and then to have your first experience of death be somebody you've been sitting next to in a classroom for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
I'd had grandparents and other people die, so I mean I was a little more used to it, and used to it because I grew up in the environment. So in those cases, my role and my parents' role was to help, since they knew a lot of those families, help those families, those kids get through this experience of a 14-year-old dying.
Mm.
Um, Other families that came when we had a funeral in the family, like when I was about 5 or 6, one of my cousins was killed in an auto accident. So in that case, when the family was coming over if they needed a break from the intensity of the wake, they just came upstairs and spent some time on our apartment, to get a cup of coffee, a glass of water, have something to eat. Then they would go back down. So for those families that were closely connected, mostly family,
Mhm.
uh, then they would just go up and down the stairs to our apartments because that was their respite. That was another place they could go to take a little break from the intensity of their own grief situation. So there was some connections there between the family and what was going on downstairs, but it was mostly separated because that was in terms of the details and the facts, because
Mhm.
Dad and my Uncle Lawrence kept that business, and they kept family for our family. So I
Well,
think
how
that,
did
yeah.
you grow up,
How did I grow up?
understanding about grief and seeing it, maybe day in and day out? What is your concept,
Okay,
and idea of grief?
thanks. Thanks for that. Well, my one of my constructs was this is what is, this is what happens. And gee, why do I figured, and when I was writing the book and went back, I figured we probably had over, on a given year, we might had about 12 to 1,300 people come to the funeral home, and walk through
Wow.
the front doors for various wakes and funerals from a January to December period.
Right.
But some people will say, "Hey, I'm having company come over," but in our house, um, part of my construct was knowing this was very common, and we, as a family, made adaptations. Like if there was a family coming over, or their guests, to come over to have their wake time, well, that meant, that I and my brothers and the neighbor kids weren't going to play basketball in the backyard, which was actually the parking lot. So,
Right.
we adjusted. When before we had in the 50s, before we had clothes dryers in the house, that meant that when the laundry was being done, you didn't hang it outside because that's would sort of detract from the grief process. I said, or we wouldn't do that. When there was another thing in our house was a saying that was sort of resonates. There's people downstairs. There's people downstairs, and that meant that if we were upstairs in our apartments, maybe playing a little too loudly with their friends, or maybe having our record players turned up a little too loud. It wasn't a yelling, but it's just my aunt or uncle, dad or mom saying, "Hey, there's people downstairs. Okay, close your door, tune the volume down." So there was that interchange. And then, it was ever present for me that um, people needed their own space to deal with what they were experiencing in this life journey.
You were being
And
taught to respect that.
yes, we were very
Yeah.
much so. Thanks for stating that. We were very much taught to respect that, and taught to, even my aunt, she was in the second floor. She also, when she was preparing meals or cooking, she would learn to, if there was activity downstairs, even if it was someone was coming in to prepare and sit with my dad or uncle to prepare for the funeral and the wake, she would close her kitchen door so that the aroma of, and open her windows to out the kitchen, so the aroma of the cooking, wouldn't go down the stairs. Not that in some families might thought that was okay. Some families might, oh, good, there's life in this house. There's things going on. There's people that live here. I'm dealing with the passing of my friend or my relative, but hey, there's people that live here. Life goes on.
Mm.
So sometimes I think, in retrospect, that maybe those sounds, those smells, those aromas might have had a range of effects on the people that were coming in and out of the downstairs. I don't think anything really totally negative, but I guess going back to your word respect, my dad and uncle always affirmed that. Hey, we want your kids to help, and we want your kids to be a part of what and know what our business is about. Here are some of the things we expect of you. And one was that is to be quiet, or maybe if we knew there was going to be a wake on a given night, um, that might not be the night we would invite kids over to have a sleepover, or anything like that. So there were different kinds of parameters that we worked with. So that
So,
that was it was
so
like.
now that you have this experience, this was your growing up.
Mhm.
Can you talk to how people actually, based on what you saw, how people actually grieve when they've lost someone? is that something unique? I know it's unique to culture, and I know Americans kind of do it based on their religious expectations or religious upbringing or their
Mm-hmm.
cultural upbringing. And my background is Italian and
Mm-hmm.
Roman Catholic. I don't identify with either of them now, but
Sure. Right.
you know, being a Roman Catholic and being Italian, we deal
Mm-hmm.
with death in a very specific way. Did you see that growing up? Or
Oh yeah.
how did people experience? What did you see?
Well, what I've learned to do, and I share some Italian heritage, and I was also raised Roman Catholic. Um, but you can probably tell from my last name, there's a little bit of Irish blood in me too, and my mom threw a little Swedish into the mix. So, I saw, I was able to observe just different ways that people, I guess, for lack of a better word, handle
Yeah.
that period of their lives. And some, I talked about how my brother and I used to open the front door and close the front door. I mean, open it and close it for people and guide
Right.
them. But we also might be sitting at a desk off to the side just to be available to people to say if they needed anything or, where's the bathroom? Those kind of things. What we would show them where to go or help in the midst of a wake. We might be helping my dad set up flowers that had just come in or bring a plant out to a table or something. So, and we certainly weren't being our degree was not to be intrusive, just to help out and be present. But some of the things I saw was just, and was just the range. Some families, some friends handled it very quietly and just very subdued. Other families were very expressive, very in terms of physicality
Mm.
or in volume of voice. Um, are you familiar with the show 6 Feet Under?
I am not. No.
Okay, there's a show that's still playing a lot called 6 Feet Under, and it was about set in LA about a family of funeral home, a director and their family, and there was one of the episodes was they were conducting a funeral, and one undertaker said to the other, they said, watch out for that one. She's a leaper. And that meant in that vernacular, in that script, that she was prone to jump into the casket. And sure enough, she did, and she jumped in. So I'd never observed that
Okay. I
myself
was
as a
about to
kid.
ask. That's
No, I never observed it, but I could see when I saw that scene in that episode, I thought, well, I imagine that happened to my dad and uncle. I just didn't maybe even know about it, or I didn't happen to be around when that might have happened.
mm,
But even even as I have gone to more wakes since I got out of the house and when I was 22 and gone to a fair number of wakes and funerals from different states and different countries, I see that the differences, and it's probably like you were mentioning, it's probably part culture, part just how that particular family handles it. And there's a certain level of respect and acceptance for how each family does it. Some you hear the sobbing and the crying and people just being overcome and then learn and then as they might be that might be how they enter the scene, but then they calm down during a time. So I remember seeing that kind of a change as I was an observer or a worker in the funeral home, seeing how an individual or a group of people might change even in a half hour's time. I mean, they might be overcome at the beginning, but then they might become very conversational. But I think that's why, when I think about it now, I think part of the purpose of a funeral home is to provide those kind of settings for people to be comfortable, to be able to be with their family, their friends, but to have different places to sit, different arrangements, you can stand, you can sit, you can pace, you can walk around, to accommodate all those different ways to experience that part of the grief.
mm,
Uh, so I think I've put that into my head, just not only in my own experience, but as I was writing the book and going back in time, when before there were funeral homes, people had their wakes and their funerals in their own houses. So when a relative died, the people came to your house,
Mm.
and then over a period, right in the 20s and 30s is when it started to change, right when my uncle was getting involved, that they developed this concept of a funeral home, so that grief wouldn't have to be in the family home, that part, they wouldn't have to live with that thought after the funeral and everything else. So they started to bring funerals to a common place like a funeral home. So that in terms of what you asked me, I think I've seen a lot of different ways, but not so much, as much as when I was growing up in the funeral home and doing my different chores in the funeral home, and just being interactive, going up and down the stairs to get to our apartment and seeing different people's reactions. But I've also seen it in the last 50 years as an adult and having gone to so many wakes and funerals for other friends and family over those years.
You're
I guess what I've come to understand, and there is no wrong way, there's no right way. There is just a variety. It's a range of ways that we as humans handle grief.
with the amount of time that we have left, talk about your book. Why did you write it, and what impact do you want to leave on people as they read it?
Thanks, Keith. Well, here's the book, Two Floors Above Grief.
Cool.
There we go. Two Floors of Grief. It's a memoir
And
of
that
two
was the
families.
actual house, or is that?
Oh yeah, good question. That is the actual house.
Wow.
The I knew this picture was available. The sketch was, so I contacted the artist who did it. She did this sketch for a historical house walk in the hometown of
That is
Elgin,
so
and
cool.
this was the cover for the program that year. So I asked her for permission to use this as the cover of the book. So here's when I talk about the funeral home being here, the second floor being this way, and then the third floor with the more gabled roof, that was the ballroom, and
Wow.
the apartment where I lived, and that was over here. That's my bedroom right there.
Cool.
So the reason you talked about why did I write it, and
Yeah.
people have asked me, how long did it take you to write this? And when people ask me, I say, oh, about 73 years, because I I was in 1950. They've already been in this house for 11 years by the time I was born. But another motivator to write it, not only the stories I had up here in my head, but my family. We had written when I was in college in Chicago and in Rome, Italy, from 1968 to 72. Some part of that time in Chicago at Loyola University, part of that time at the Loyola's campus in Rome. We did a lot of letter writing back and forth. And we wrote letters because even when I was living in Chicago, only 30, 40 miles away, it was too expensive to make a phone call at that time. Of course, there's nothing. We didn't even know the word cell phone. But in 1968, 69, you made your calls on a telephone. But the charges for that was considered long distance. And so we didn't make calls. So we wrote letters back and forth. And then, especially then in my junior year, 70, 71, when I went to Rome, there was a lot of letters. These letters were all saved. And as people accumulated them and in files or boxes or shoe boxes or whatever, eventually they all started coming to me for whatever reason.
Wow.
And so I ended up with about 700 to 800 pages of letters. And so I took these letters about 6, 7 years ago. I took these letters and I thought, what am I going to do with these letters? So I organized them in sequence and then I read them all through again. Most of them were from my dad and mom, others from my aunt and uncle, cousins here and there. And I sequenced them and I read through them all.
Wow.
And I thought,
You
there's the
sequence
story.
by date.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
that was how I organized, how I did it. Other letter organizers might do it differently, but my initial sense was to organize them and I got
Like a
plastic,
timeline.
yeah, and I got plastic sleeves, and I put them in notebook. There ended up with 4-inch 4-inch binders, and then
Wow.
I put a label on the outside of the binder that says that this is for this range of years. But then I read through every letter, and then I determined, hey, this could be a book. This could be the letters reveal the characters. So yes, I'll be able to tell stories, based on my own memory. But when I use these letters, it's going to be the actual people talking. It's not going to be me making up dialogue. It's their voice.
Right.
And so when I put all that together, I took a writing class or two and how to organize all this and had some nice guidance. And then when I got into an outline form and started typing, and then taking excerpts of these letters, I really felt as I was at my keyboard typing from those letters, whoever the writer was, and they might have written in their own hand or typewriters. I could see them typing. I could see them writing. They had different types of stationery that they were using. Um, I really felt their presence in my fingers as
Wow.
I transposed their letters into my own
You were
keyboard.
absorbing their story. Wow.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And the other fascinating thing about the letters was they didn't keep, like my mom she worked out of the home. She was in an office. My aunt was in her kitchen. My dad would maybe write something at his desk. My uncle might write something. Sometimes they would all be writing on this, maybe on the same, within the same couple days, about the same incident at home that was going on, a family story, or,
Mhm.
maybe something they were doing socially. And so I would get these letters in my mailbox in Rome about the same time, and they didn't even know they had put them in the mail or that they wrote at the same time.
I think
So
that's
then
kind of
I would,
weird.
that was kind of weird, but I would have these different viewpoints, and
Yeah.
they weren't far apart, but different interpretations of the same incident, and just the kind of communication that they wanted to generate with me at the time. And they would just sit down at a table and write, and then they knew after a while how much postage to put on to send to Rome, and they would stick it in the mailbox and get it sent off. But so when I was reading these letters again a couple of years ago, and then I thought, well, this is going to be so in the book. A lot of most of the chapters contain references to these letters, and I'll tie back or tie in the story I'm telling to a letter that's from my mom or from my dad, from my aunt or from my uncle. And so that's part of the reason for writing the book. And also the reason was the most intimate reason was from my two brothers and I and my six cousins. We have over 100 offspring together that keep procreating. I think
Oh my God.
we're into the grandchild and great grandchild range. So I wanted them, and we all talk as we get together for reunions or things. We talk, hey, remember that time? Remember that? And I wanted something that would sort of put together those stories, not only for us and our generation and the next one, but for those generations beyond. So it's become sort of a testimony to how the business got started, why we have these stories, who we were. As I was editing the book and working with other advisors, they said, hey, your book isn't just for your family. There's a lot of families that live in the place where their family business is. There's a lot of every family experiences grief. Every family has things, and with their cousins, with their brothers, with their moms. I have a whole chapter in there about the difficulty my parents and I had during the Vietnam War in terms of our allegiances. So I think those kind of things resonate with a lot of people. So through the work of the editors I was working with, we sort of reframed the book a little bit because from the start I didn't want it to have just an appeal to my family, which it does, and we've had some super conversations in writing since then. But what I've found with the editor's help is the effect it's had on other people from my town, on other people that have experienced grief, of other people who have written me to say, hey, I was raised in a funeral home. I felt the same. I felt very similar to you. Or I had somebody write about the chapter about Vietnam. Hey, what you talked about was very similar to what I felt in 1970. So, and those were comments that weren't from my family. So the reason I wrote it was to make some sense of all these letters I had, to find an outlet for our family stories for my immediate family, but then to provide a further outreach to people that can connect with the stories and on levels that I didn't even predict they would, but has been coming across in the reviews and other communication I get.
I love it. I totally love it. How can people find you? Where are you on the web? I think you're on LinkedIn. Are you anywhere else?
I'm LinkedIn, I'm Facebook. Did I send you those things? You post
You're
those in
going
your,
to.
huh? You've got
You're,
them already?
no,
Yeah.
you're going to send them to me.
Okay, I didn't know if
I'm
I
going to
had
put
or
them in
not.
the description.
Great, great, good. I'll get those to you. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. My website is KevinO'ConnorAuthor.com. The book, Two Floors, can be purchased at Amazon's the most direct source, but I encourage people to go to their independent bookstores and order it. An independent bookstore can get it for you too. So if they want to support their independent bookstores, or even a chain like Barnes and Noble too, they can go there and get it ordered. It's accessible there, or they can write me and I can get them a copy. But this and embedded in my website is a way to contact me through email and do that. So that's ways they can get a hold of me, or we can have further conversations. Once a person's email gets on my back to me, I include them in a newsletter that audience of a newsletter that I send out about every week, just about what's happening with the book and stories I've been picking up. I have a section that's called Where in the World is 2 Floors Above Grief? People take the book and they take a picture. I've had it taken in different islands and in Australia, different places. So where it goes, then they take a picture and I post that in the newsletter, and just ways of trying to work other ways. I'm working to create community around some of the topics in the book and things like that. So that's part of what I got going on in terms of helping the book have continued life since its
Excellent.
publication.
Excellent. Kevin, I love it. I appreciate your time with me today. I appreciate the conversation as always. This has been another edition of the Question Guy podcast. I will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks very much. Thank you.